Today we have a discussion about the cryptocurrencies, and the main idea of this panel discussion is to show that the price is only essential, but not the key property of the cryptocurrencies. However, to make everyone on the same level of understanding about the cryptocurrencies in general, I will make a short presentation about the concept, the framework, and afterwards we will move to a panel discussion in which we will have participants such as Remigijus Šimašius, who used to be the president of a free market institution in Lithuania. He used to be the Minister of Justice in Lithuania, and he's now the Member of Parliament. Then we will have Brad Scott, who is the alternative finance activist. He is also the author for Independent Guardian. He also has written some books on the alternative finance. And he's a quite known speaker on Bitcoin in general. So, actually, sometimes you should ask the question yourself, is it Bitcoin from capital letter or Bitcoin from small letter? Because most people perceive Bitcoin as a currency, which is actually from the small letter. While Bitcoin in general is actually the protocol, peer-to-peer protocol, to send value from client to client. You actually can see it as the email, as the email is a way to send the message. The Bitcoin is the same way to send the value. And then the Bitcoin is actually the unit used in this protocol, which is actually what you send. So you have to have something to send the value, so he has to have a value higher than zero. But it doesn't matter if the value is 1 cent or $1,000. So it's important to distinguish between these two concepts. Actually, also Bitcoin is known as a virtual currency, cryptocurrency, or digital money. And what is the key difference between digital money and electronic money? In general, many of you are using electronic money in your life, and the probably best examples of electronic money in general are PayPal, M-Pesa mobile wallets in Africa, or let's say Paysera, MLT. And key thing of electronic money is that it actually has an issuer. Also, it is covered by the fiat currency, let's say euros and so on. And generally, it's just like the numbers of the money being in the bank account you see in the computer. And the key drawbacks of it, the usage is limited because usually the sender and receiver has to be the participants of the same system. While on the other hand, we have digital money, which are decentralized. However, they are not covered by the fiat currency, and many people perceive it as a drawback, and probably is. But then you don't have a counterparty, you don't have an institution which is issuing money. So when you make a transaction, you actually make it direct to the receiver, the same way you do with cash, and you don't have a counterparty risk. And to make information, there's not only Bitcoin, which is a digital currency, there's also like Litecoin, Peercoin, to name but a few. As every coin, Bitcoin also has two sides, the dark side and the bright side. The strength of Bitcoin is actually, like if you're looking in the different parameters, from the decentralization parameter. We don't have a counterparty risk, and also you have a low transactions because there's no middleman involved. While that leads, because it's not backed by a normal currency, you have a high volatility. You don't have a controlling body which is responsible for it. Also, sometimes you have liquidity issues because there's no party who's supposed to buy it back. Then you have this pseudonymity because you don't identify your name when you use Bitcoins. So actually you get the privacy, while on the other side, of the drawback side, you have a money laundering risk, which actually can be solved because Bitcoin is not anonymous, it's only pseudonymous, so institutions can identify the real transactions. And also you have a fraud risk because you actually cannot identify the real receiver.
You speak slower, please.
Of course I can.
Thank you.
So it's also IT-based, which means it's easy to integrate. However, on the other side, it requires a lot of IT knowledge and how to use it. As well, it raises additional security issues because with electronic money, you have money in bank. So if your system is hacked, the money don't leave a system, so it can be walked back. While Bitcoins are stored in their digital form, so there's a high risk of them being stolen. In general, there are three key groups of Bitcoin users. The first group are early adopters, who actually started to use Bitcoin, let's say, 2 years ago or so on. They mainly like the idea of a decentralized currency, a currency which doesn't belong to any country. Also the aspect which is like cryptocurrency based. And they have this know-how how to use it. Then the second wave of the users was speculators, actually the people who try to benefit from the changes in value of virtual currencies, especially Bitcoin. And these people more perceive it as an asset class. Their actually needs are like high liquidity and quick payments. While the most important group and the group for which Bitcoin was created are business entrepreneurs. That's the people who want to use Bitcoin as a way of payment. And these people mainly have the different needs, because they actually need stability. They need stability also in IT side. They want to benefit not from the price changes, but from the lower transactions. That's why they are looking for the stable price. Many people think that Bitcoin, the protocol, is only solely used for the payments, and that's now. But however, the blockchain on which Bitcoin is based can be used for other ways. In general, the payments nowadays sometimes are used for the marketing. As you can see, like some companies accept Bitcoins, but that's more just to attract the people who like Bitcoin or want to try it. Then sometimes you can see there are frictions to make a payment, such, let's say, when there are protesters in Maidan in Ukraine, they can get their donations through Bitcoin from any place in the world. Also, there are some ideas who can benefit on Bitcoin frictionless transactions, such as Wi-Fi routers. Then you can charge for every minute the client is using Wi-Fi at your place. And that you can benefit for small transactions, let's say, of 1 cent per minute and so on, which is probably impossible to do with most of usual ways of payment, like credit cards and so on. Also, the next stage in the Bitcoin development is most likely to be the usage of blockchain, of this decentralized ledger for other assets. So some of the examples are like colored coins or Mastercoin or Counterparty. These things mostly focus on making the, let's say, asset exchange based on the blockchain, when you can assign the ownership to the blockchain, while the better example probably is the Namecoin, which actually tries to replicate the DNS based on the blockchain. Then you have a decentralized domain name solution, which actually decentralize all the domain names from ICAP. And today's discussion actually will be that the price of cryptocurrency is essential for it, but it's not the key property. And the first question we would like to cover today is actually about the usage of Bitcoin as an idea for not only for payments, but for other protocols, let's say such as Mastercoin or so on, when using Bitcoin to blockchain in general, like crypto protocols, to transfer the ownership of the assets. And I think it would be, Brett can start take his opinion.
Cool, yeah, well thanks for that. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Bitcoin as a concept. It sort of takes kind of a while to get your head around it. And I guess maybe what I should try and talk a bit about is what the concept more generally might be able to, how you could apply it beyond something like a currency system. Just to put it in sort of fairly basic terms, the basic, I guess the brilliance of the Bitcoin protocol comes from two things. There's a sort of a sense the first thing is a decentralized ledger. Basically, if you imagine the ability to hold, imagine an Excel spreadsheet, which was held by lots and lots of different people all at once. So it's like a decentralized ledger. It's not controlled by any one person. And then the sort of second aspect is a way of putting information onto that ledger. In the case of the Bitcoin system, people are putting currency transactions onto that ledger. The resultant, what you get as a result of that is a way of measuring currency transactions without any central intermediary being involved. Most of our currency transactions nowadays involve commercial banks. Most electronic payments you make are basically you sending a message to a bank asking it to transfer to another bank. With the Bitcoin system, you're sending that message to a decentralized network and asking the network to record it on a ledger. We can, from that point, ask what other applications we could have for that, and I think you mentioned a few there. Any kind of digital asset, let's say shares or a claim on property or maybe a patent or something like maybe a song you record. You could theoretically send it to a decentralized ledger and record it there, and it would be frozen in time and people could see that you actually recorded it. So I guess that's something you should, perhaps as entrepreneurs, be thinking about. How could I use this concept of a decentralized ledger to help society? One of the most interesting things I think about in a decentralized ledger, for me, is the notion of voting systems. I'm from South Africa, but a lot of my family's from Zimbabwe. One of the big problems in places like Zimbabwe is that you have a political system where you cannot trust the voting authorities to accurately record. Imagine your ledger now. your Excel spreadsheet recording votes. You know, people are counting up at different voting stations. Can you imagine that was not actually held by a voting authority controlled by the government in Zimbabwe, but was actually held in a decentralized manner? So that could be a potential interesting application of a ledger type technology with Bitcoin. So we can talk about that maybe, but I'll pass it on.
Good afternoon, everyone. Of course, I know least of this, of three of us about Bitcoins, but I also have to add something to this discussion. And first of all, I would like to say that I'm very glad that it's separation of two very important functions of money, in Bitcoin in this case, what money plays in society. And first is helping to accumulate capital, accumulate wealth, to contribute to capital investment, which we intend not to focus very much on, as moderator said. And the second function of money, which is also very important, is to transfer property. It's related, but it's different. And I'm very glad that when we speak about Bitcoins, we do focus about transfer of property. But there is one but. If we want to transfer property, we have to transfer property. And if we are transferring property, the thing we are transferring, it has to have some value. And here we come to Bitcoin, how the value of Bitcoin, where it springs from, and so on and so on. And here I must say that I'm a supporter and follower of Austrian theory of money and credit. And let me just say a few sentences about the thing, how money emerges in society in general. I guess that if I would ask you how did we get money in society? I'm not sure about you, but in majority of audiences, the answer is definite. Of course, government have created money. This is the typical answer today. People are used to the fact that government does create money. To that extent that, for example, today we had a debate in Parliament about leaving litas and switching to euro, that of course the argument of sovereignty was one of the most important, that what a state it will be without the money. But then we forget about the real story, how money emerged. If you want something to become a money, this something has to have a value in itself, value which is valuable to produce something, to use somehow. And it happens that, of course, direct exchange of, I don't know, cow into a car or into an apple or so, it's very, very complicated and practically impossible. You have to have medium of exchange. And of course, the thing which has some specific values besides its intrinsic value suddenly becomes this medium of exchange. And throughout history, of course, gold was the main thing which became money, because it is easy to divide gold. It's very difficult to have lots of gold just out of the air. You have to dig it and to employ your work in it, and so on and so on. So gold became money. Gold became money. Something became money, and when you look how it became money, it was exactly the thing how Bitcoin is becoming money. It's completely decentralized. It doesn't have supervising authority. It doesn't have anything. It just became money because people decided that gold is worth using as a medium of exchange, as a medium of transferring property as well. So this is the story which is similar to Bitcoin, and this is the part of the story why I do think that Bitcoin does have, or maybe some other cryptocurrencies has some bright future. But the problem is that in case of gold, almost everyone understands what gold is. You may understand that you may make a jewelry out of gold, not speaking about other more sophisticated uses. When speaking about cryptocurrencies, about Bitcoin, okay, I was trying to understand it as deeply as I can, but in fact I have to admit that I do not understand how it's produced. I do not get the idea, essentially. I know that some people do understand, I do trust those people, that's okay. But in general, if Bitcoin has a problem that it doesn't have an intrinsic value. If not a medium of exchange, if not a mean to accumulate value, it's nothing. It's nothing then. Gold or silver or everything, it's something even without being a money. you can still use it for something. You cannot use Bitcoin for something else besides these particular reasons. And this opens a huge, big question. So what the kind of money it is? In this respect, doesn't have a big difference with the state-created money, which is just created out of the air. Bitcoin is also created just somehow, with some additional features, but still. And so it means that this Bitcoin as a means to accumulate value, to assist to capital accumulation and capital investment is still under big question. Time is needed just to prove that it's a trustable thing. When we speak about transfers of property, actually, I was giving an example, not knowing that you are from South Africa, that if you want to transfer some property, some money from Lithuania to Zimbabwe, of course, using traditional methods, would become quite expensive, I guess. And of course, you have to invent something else. And Bitcoins is one of the means which allows to transfer this very easily in the same way as to transfer money from me to you, sitting right here close to each other. And of course, Bitcoin is very useful in this sense. The main question is still, does it have a future? Because in order to transfer, you still to have an intrinsic value. So this is my biggest question, and also biggest perspective speaking about the future of Bitcoins.
I would also like to add up like few different dimensions, because Bitcoin would make it different because it is decentralized ledger and it reduces actually the counterparty risk. Because maybe like some centralized solutions, let's say like PayPal or so on, they probably are as efficient as Bitcoin, but then they include this counterparty risk because you have a middleman in every transaction, and both sides have to be on the clients of the same middleman. While the decentralized solutions lets you transfer value without having a middleman the same way you do it with cash or like any tangible good. While for payments it's okay, but like when you want to go up and use the blockchain public ledger for something else, even like the same as Brett said for voting. Maybe it's a good solution like to use some cryptography-based voting system to avoid a scam of votes, but then you have to identify each voter. So still you have to have a counterparty which has to match the identity of a person to the vote. And then you still lack this credibility. It's actually the same way in like what these solutions like colored coins or MasterCard are trying to do. They're trying to use the concept of blockchain of decentralized ledger, the centralized database, to transfer the ownership. But that would look more like the center of registers when you assign that this asset belongs to this person, and instead of having this register in one place, you have it decentralized over internet. But still, you have to, at some place, you have to actually attach the ownership of that bottle to let's say, public key in that database. So that still doesn't solve the counterparty problem. On the other hand, another dimension is that some private companies try to replicate Bitcoin protocol for their usage. So that's, as an example, is like a Ripple. Also, like JP Morgan tried to patent something similar to Bitcoin. But in that case, in the best case scenario, like Ripple is trying to do, when you have these, let's say, the doors to the system who are actually kind of centralized because only the participants of the system will accept new participants. That doesn't make it like as decentralized as Bitcoin is, because Bitcoin is kind of like a water. Everyone can join the system. So in that sense, I mean, like for usage above only the currencies, above value transfers, they have to think about the counterparty. The next question I would like to ask is about the freedom of expression, because there's a nice notion in the society going on that spending is a way of expression. Like you have a right to say anything you want, so it should be the same way you have the right to spend and donate, let's say, or buy to anyone you want. And in that sense, you now are kind of censored because you either have to pay high transaction fees to pay somebody, or even sometimes you are forbidden to donate to somebody or somebody to accept money from you because there are a lot of constraints because of these counterparties. So actually I would like to ask my colleagues, do they think that this freedom of expression as like freedom of spending can be persuaded up by usage of Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies?
If I may start, I think it's very, very related to the question we discussed at first with this non-existence of third party in transferring money. Because just to clarify this first question, if I want to give like 100 liters to you, I just take a paper and give it to you and no third party is participating in that. If I want to transfer 100 liters to you, we have to involve at least one bank. At least one bank. If we are clients of the same bank, if we are clients of different banks, 2 banks are involved. If we are clients in different countries, maybe I'm in Lithuania, you are in Zimbabwe, maybe there will be even more than 2 banks. So there are many third parties involved in this, and of course it creates some additional cost, additional control, additional everything. While just giving money is paper money, for example, is no third parties involved. Of course, cryptocurrencies do solve this problem in a way. No third parties do participate in sending this money. But on the other hand, I must say, from practical reasons, participation of third party is not a problem as such. If you look to as Paysera, I understand it's a sponsor of this hall, and also their competitors like MLT was also mentioned in the presentation. What kind of it's of course not digital money; it's electronic money. But what kind of change they were managed to bring into Lithuania at least? Price of some transfers dropped by 100 times after this type of companies entered the market. Transferring money from one country to another country, instead of being 70 liters, suddenly became 70 cents. Of course, banks have reduced the price as well, but still, essentially it solved the problem. Bitcoin may allow it transferring on zero cost, on zero, but okay, 70 cents or 0 cents, it's not such a big difference if you compare 70 liters and 0 cents. And in a way, the problem is almost solved by other parties, but answering this particular your questions, of course, when I have just my cash money, nobody is practically able to control where I spend this money. That's practicality. Only if you involve third party, you become eligible actually to control how and on what purpose you spend your money. So as in the case of cash money, nobody is able to track you in the market, or speaking about donations in the church, how much we give or whatever. The same is with the bitcoins, and of course it solves the problem. Does it have the black side of it? Of course it does, and you also mentioned that. Of course, black market also may use this good side of Bitcoin turning into a black side.
Yeah, so I think you covered quite a lot of the issues there. So one thing I wanted to say is there's differing, back to this notion quickly on the sort of the value, where Bitcoin derives its value from. One great thing about experimenting with Bitcoin is it really messes with people's notions about how money works. And actually a lot of old school theories of commodity money and stuff are being quite sort of disrupted. But actually a lot of people in the Bitcoin community classify themselves as conservative libertarians, who often have this idea that money is a commodity, right? And you can kind of, it emerges from commodities. The amazing thing about Bitcoin is it sort of has the appearance of being a commodity while it's clearly not actually being a commodity, and it has no actual use. But of course, I mean, you can apply the same principle to gold, actually. Well, we're not going to go down this route because we could have this debate. And if you'll tend to find with most sort of original societies, gold had actually had no value. Even Adam Smith says this. So gold is something which gets induced value in the context of a certain economic base, much like Bitcoin does. When you first got involved with Bitcoin, it was amazing. It had no value. The value was induced and created by the culture around it. Basically, it's sort of it's created by network effects, much like the state currencies sort of do nowadays, because they're backed by a state as well. But the fact that you'll be prepared to use it is that you believe everyone else around you believes it, will use it. There's a whole sort of system around it. And also for the record, stuff like gold coinage in society historically emerged with the origins of military states paying soldiers. Actually, you find most societies do not organically form gold coinage. They mostly form systems of reciprocity, which actually Ripple has embedded in it. But we don't have to talk about that now. Going back to now, in terms of like this notion of financial expression. I mean, it's a kind of a strange idea, but we do understand that when we talk about cash. I mean, cash gives us a certain type of freedom. You can kind of walk around and engage in exchange with people. without having to ask permission from some third party like PayPal or Barclays Bank or whoever. And in a way, there's a certain type of freedom there. Actually, I think if you had to eliminate cash from society, you would probably have popular revolts in the sense that people wouldn't be able to feel like they had the ability to make very small, spontaneous transactions. So for example, you're walking down the street and you see a busker playing the guitar and you want to give this person something. If you had to go through some electronic system and try to ask your bank to transfer to their bank, it would probably be a very inefficient and actually also quite a stifling way of living. People want that cash for that reason. So Bitcoin actually is interesting in that it has formed a form of online cash, and this is actually quite useful for small-scale transactions, almost quite like gift economy transactions. A lot of bloggers, for example, will put up donations on their site so you can send them Bitcoin directly, and it's almost like the digital equivalent of flipping somebody a coin as you walk past them. It's a very different feeling if you're trying to give somebody a gift and you're trying to go through some third party. So that's one thing I'd say in terms of the expression. At the same time, I mean, I don't think people base their identities on how their consumption patterns. I think people's identities are based much more on their creativity and what they actually make in society rather than how their spending choices. So I'll challenge you on that.
Yeah. Actually, what I would like to adapt, because probably the best way of expression when you look at the elections, and usually when you vote, you actually vote in secrecy, so you are not constrained by some people observing your actions. So it should be similar in finance, because you want to avoid that somebody from the third party would know where you spend, how you spend. That's why the beauty of Bitcoin being pseudo-anonymous, anonymous, when actually only the legal forces like the government can actually observe how you did the transaction. It's nice because, let's say you donate to somebody which you like secretly, but you are not proud to shout around that I like this company. So you don't want even your bank accountant to know that you donated, let's say, to their own party or so on. So I think that's, and then people say there's a drawback from this freedom of expression when you can use the cryptocurrencies for the illegal things. But on the other side, the illegal things don't go in only one way. Actually, when you pay for something illegal, you have to actually get the legal good or get a legal service, and the actual control works on that side. And even if you consider that this illegal part, like this of Bitcoin that's mostly involved with criminals, is only most a myth, because firstly you have to think that it's pseudo-anonymous. Actually, every transfer can be identified. In addition to this, every transaction can be identified, and in addition to this, they are forced to take actions before coming back. The next question is relating more to the efficiency, because when people look at the Bitcoin, they scale to things, because many people say that Bitcoin is too volatile, because its price goes up, down, and so on, and it's not so unstable, and people don't want to use it. While on the other hand, people argue that it's extremely efficient, because you have close to zero transaction cost, and you actually can get the cash extremely quickly, because that also means that you have to have a lower working capital for a company. So I think I probably would like to begin this answering this question. So my key argument for the efficiency of Bitcoin is that, if you look for the volatility of Bitcoin, the price stability, looking back for a month, 2 months, when you say, it's extremely volatile because it has been up to 800 and down to 400, and that's the volatility you don't want to have. But if you look for a short period of time, when you actually make the payment, let's say it's 1 day or several hours, when actually the transaction happens, even I sometimes calculated the volatility and still do it for myself on Excel, and then actually found that this short-term volatility is even less than 2%, sometimes 3%, and then you compare to the alternative way of payment, let's say the credit cards, which usually charge the small merchants from 2 to 3% for the transaction. So I think you can trade off and take this volatility of losing 3% of your value than just for sure losing 3% for another way of payment. So actually I would like you to adapt on this efficiency against stability debate.
Yes, I mean, I actually transact in Bitcoin quite a lot, and to be honest, if you want to answer this question, just go and use it yourself. Just go start with a small amount and actually try and experience it, because you'll learn a huge amount in a short amount of time. You'll discover that using Bitcoin is actually very, very simple. In terms of, compared to, say, using an internet bank account, it's a lot simpler than that. You just download a wallet, and you can, there's various startups that are trying to offer services around it as well. So it's comparatively easy thing to use. But of course, there's this issue of this perceived price volatility. So I sell my book for Bitcoin, for example. I've paid for design services. I've paid interns of mine, people working for me in Bitcoin. So I've always tried to experiment with using it. But it is a big problem, the fact that while it might be very easy to use, there's this constant fluctuation of it in terms of other currencies. If you think about why this is the case, and this is probably the biggest issue facing the Bitcoin community right now, is that it actually has no real world connection to the real economy. So if you, when you think about how you use your normal currency, your liters here, you know, like when I arrived here, I went to the ATM and I took out some liters, and I looked at that note, and in my mind, I have absolutely no idea what that note means to me. You have to actually learn how a currency relates to various items. Once I've learned that this here might cost 4 liters, I can start to think about how all the other prices work. So basically, pricing in our head works as a network. We have this, and actually currency starts to form, it's it's an intermediary, we start to form ideas. But in and of itself, you cannot make a decision about what that should cost just by looking at the currency. You have to know how all the things relate. And Bitcoin has this problem. It doesn't have enough real goods and services that are independently priced in it, that you can actually start to have an independent idea of what it should be, what things should cost. So as a result, everyone is pricing it in relation to other currencies. So that makes it very, very difficult for it to compete with national currencies right now, which is why actually a lot of entrepreneurs are what they're trying to think about is how they could use it as an intermediary between national currencies. So as a sort of a form of switching from one currency into another. So almost like a payments infrastructure rather than a currency in itself. So that remains to be seen how that goes.
I would like to say that in this respect, efficiency versus fluctuation and non-reliability in this sense, I think that in order to have a currency as such, you have to have both features. It's impossible to have a currency with only one feature. If you have a currency which is theoretically you may use for holding your cash holdings, just to hold it, but you are not allowed to transfer it, it will not be a currency. If you have something which you may transfer easily, but it doesn't have value, or value is completely unpredictable, it's also not a currency. You may send SMS messages or whatever, and you may call it money, but it's not money because it doesn't have value in itself. So in order to have efficiency, you have to have both features. Of course, if one currency is fluctuating, but it's much easier to transfer property in it, you have to measure one against other. Of course, your simple calculation, let's say I'm spending half an hour in making a transaction in Bitcoins, buying and selling them, and my risk of losing 2% of value is no higher than price of transferring property using other means, MasterCard or whatever. So of course it's a simple calculation in your case. In some other case, it might be a little bit more different. If you need to hold it for a day, a week, a month, a year, and so on. So you have to calculate, but of course, the more fluctuation you have, the less suitable it is also for transaction. Not only for holding, cash or semi-cash holding, Bitcoin holding, or how to call it, I don't know, but also for transferring. So that's my reply to it. Maybe one additional question is that when we speak about fluctuations of currencies, sometimes we are very much misled by what we do actually measure. It's also fluctuation against some other currencies. Because when we sometimes speak about typical currencies of today, euro or dollar, for example, and we start to measure how euro is raising against dollar or vice versa, in fact, when you take a broader spectrum, all the currencies are falling down. And in fact, you can measure it against many other things, including the same gold, which proved still to be a shadow currency of the world. Still, maybe Bitcoin will change it someday. I'm not sure about it, but it's always fluctuation against everything. So maybe theoretically, a day will come when we will say that, for example, euro is fluctuating because it has different value against Bitcoin, but we will not say that Bitcoin is fluctuating because it has different value against euro. So it's vice versa. Of course, Bitcoin is still a marginal currency, and then we speak about fluctuations of Bitcoin, which is quite a natural thing.
Actually, I would like to adapt to this topic because I think that still people perceive Bitcoin as a concept of a store of value instead of just a medium of exchange. That actually makes people, because like in perfect world, if you see Bitcoin just only as a medium of exchange, as a protocol to transfer value, when somebody wants to buy something with Bitcoins, so actually you perfectly exchange euros to Bitcoins, let's say get 1 Bitcoin, then they pay 1 Bitcoin for a bottle of water, then the merchant, the seller, actually immediately exchanges that 1 Bitcoin back to euros. So actually the user side should see like only transaction in euros, which is based on Bitcoin, and by matching the supply and demand of Bitcoins, the price should be extremely stable. However, many people perceive it as an asset class, and they think it's kind of a store of value that actually makes the market imperfect. However, as we can see, there are many areas of Bitcoin from efficiency, from asset pricing and so on, which still has to be discussed. And Bitcoin is still an experiment, both economic-wise, IT-wise, and it actually has to attract more people, more minds. And the next question is, as Bitcoin is still a kind of a financial thing and is mostly proposed by financial institutions like startups and so on. Also, there are some foundations like Bitcoin Foundation or Global Bitcoin Islands. There are institutions who try to actually promote Bitcoin for the global audience. The next question would be actually, who is responsible about not promoting Bitcoin, but actually teaching about Bitcoin from the neutral side? Is it like the companies who are doing it now? Should it be some like stronger foundation, or should it be someone else?
Well, I mean, like the problem with Bitcoin is that it's not a problem necessarily, but there's lots of different interest groups. I mean, you mentioned the early adopters being the sort of IT, sort of tech hacker type community. That's true, but actually a lot of part of the early adopters as well, where you find the libertarian community and the anarchist community. So, you know, anarchism like a left-wing version of libertarianism. And actually there's a big political streak in Bitcoin, which is actually one of the reasons now there's a schism that's developed in the community between purists who have these sort of political ideals of what it's supposed to mean, some kind of they see some kind of salvation in this means of exchange, and your sort of more Silicon Valley style community who sees in Bitcoin a way to basically augment the existing banking system. You can clearly see those two groups have got different agendas, and they've got different ways of trying to promote it. And actually recently there was a breakaway group called Dark Wallet. You should go check them out. Like, they were started by Cody Wilson and Miyataki. There's a few of them around. Basically they're sort of the hardcore anarchist / libertarian wing, where they're basically coming out against the Bitcoin Foundation, sort of saying this is an industry group trying to promote for industry purposes. We want to have this political movement. And actually, but one thing that both groups suffer from is that they're actually, like, I used to work in the financial industry. I used to work in over-the-counter derivatives, sort of investment banking sort of area. You know, and actually, that whole world has got this language which that people speak there, which is almost it basically excludes everybody else from understanding what's going on. And actually the Bitcoin community has a problem right now where that's happening as well. People are developing an exclusionary language, which is actually making it harder and harder. So one thing which would be amazing for the Bitcoin community to do is to make an overt effort to design the language such that even the most complicated things in Bitcoin appear simple. And so you don't go down that sort of techie, kind of cliquey route. And I think that would do wonders for actually democratizing currency. I don't know if that answers your question properly, to be honest.
Actually, as we are running out of time, I probably would jump to a question which is most important for Remigijus, and we want to hear his opinion. Is actually about the regulation. To make short, because many governments in Europe and abroad, they took the warning that the Bitcoin is very volatile, and then they took actually this wait-and-see approach. And actually, I would like to hear Remigijus' opinion about, is it like this wait-and-see approach good, or should governments be proactive in it and so on?
Lithuanian central bank also issued a warning that Bitcoin is not regulated and is not safe because of lack of regulation. So this is quite a typical approach of central bank, which is, I think, also copy-pasted from other warning. Is not a unique one. I think that, of course, speaking about the role of central banks, mainly, maybe not so much of government, I think that trying to explain and describe is a good thing, including warning, but taking positions that this kind of good, which is new good and created suddenly out of the creativity of decentralized people, is dangerous in itself because it's just we don't understand it and it's new. I think it's not a fair approach. It's as good as many other newly created things, and I think that this warning has to be issued very carefully, not to frighten people about things which are new and clear. And also about your last question before about who have to educate, I think nobody has to educate, this, except of course bankers, central bankers. They have to explain to their clients, because I expect from them to explain about different instruments and financial instruments as well. If I was a school teacher of economics, of course I would explain something about bitcoins in the class when we discuss what is currency in general. So I think that's whose responsibility is to spread this message.
Yeah, talking about the education side from my perspective, because actually how I wanted to turn this question is mostly about the academic side, because if you look for the academic papers on cryptocurrencies in general, there are some good IT papers, and like from economic perspective, there are only like some papers about how exchanges fail, and that's all. They don't discuss about the impact of, let's say, the private money or the crypto money for the economy, because even like cryptocurrencies actually relate to the Austrian economy, let's say like the hike approach that money can be private. Maybe they will not dominate in future, but they can be a competitive, make a competition for the normal money to them to make improvements in the transactions. And from my perspective about regulation, like the government's more focused on this asset pricing approach of Bitcoin. They don't think that probably it's better to, let's say, not to get the evil people or incompetent people into the finance industry through this not regulation of cryptocurrency industry. That's why I mean the government should probably more proactive think not about promoting Bitcoin, no way, but they should more actually think how the existing rules should be adopted to these new concepts, because as I mentioned before, we have a pretty good rules for electronic money which are covered by cash and it's actually easy to understand, while we don't have anything for the virtual money, and we are actually out of time now. So it's now a Q&A time. So any questions?
We have some questions on Twitter from our audience, so I'll give you this device and that you could read it and answer it.
So question number one is, do you support the idea of removing control over the money supply from private corporations as ECB, FED, or Bank of Lithuania? So I think it's firstly for Remigijus to comment.
Could you repeat the question first?
Do you support the idea? So actually I can probably start to like, it's about monetary policy. So like from my approach, Bitcoin will never solve and actually can make a trouble for monetary policy. So that's why countries still should have like their own currencies, or like economic communities, let's say like EU, and they should still follow like produce a money supply. While Bitcoin is more a protocol, a way to transfer money between these separate communities.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether I understand the question correctly, because the ECB and other banks are not private institutions. The question is about competition of currencies in general in society. I think that competition is a good thing in all fields, including money supply. I think that monopoly in money supply, it creates or allows very bad features of any currency to exist, and of course Bitcoin does contribute to simply the choice of people, which allows competition, which allows surviving of the best alternative. But I'm not sure whether I understood the question.
Yeah, one thing I'd say about that, I mean, there's a pervasive myth that central banks create money for a start. Actually, most of the money supply is created by the commercial banking system. So the idea that somehow the money supply is controlled by the central bank is I mean, even the Bank of England states that that's not true. I mean, so this is the fractional reserve banking system is what creates most of the money supply. There's nothing inherent about Bitcoin in itself. It doesn't prevent fractional reserve banking. It's entirely, I'm not sure if you guys understand fractional reserve banking, but you know, if right now there's no financial system in Bitcoin. So you have a currency But if you could take that currency and basically issue notes against it, like current banks do, you could expand the Bitcoin money supply as much as you wanted, basically. So, much like you could take gold and then expand gold via a fractional reserve banking system to have a lot more claims on gold than there actually is gold in your cellars. So. I think I would challenge this notion that somehow central banks are what determine money supply in society for a start.
If I may a little bit also so have a remark on this. This is a new tendency to speak about financial theory that central banks do not have essential role in money supply at all. But in fact, this is true only in this respect that the reserve which is required by central banks actually came to zero. Right now, if decades ago we were still speaking about 10 or something %, now it's zero, and of course it means that multiplier through commercial banks is the main actual contributor to increase of amount of money. But in fact, commercial banks only commercial banks were not able to supply new additional money without a support and rules stated by central bank. So it's a kind of mutual game.
I think this question is more related to for Brad. Actually, the question is, what do you think about Dogecoin? Dogecoin.
Dogecoin's great. Who asked this question? Yeah. So Dogecoin's a very interesting cryptocurrency. It's basically a cryptocurrency based on a dog, but not only any dog. It's actually a sort of a meme, an internet meme. People thought Dogecoin was a joke. And this is what the most incredibly powerful aspect of Dogecoin was, how it cut right to the heart of how a lot of currency actually works, which is basically emotion and culture. People need to believe in something. In the case of gold, you're believing in a certain abstract ideal about what gold means. You know, it's something that, rulers cloak themselves in gold. You can't actually do anything with gold, really, for most people. But you have this sort of abstract cultural ideal that you attach to it, because you always think it's valuable. In the case of Bitcoin, its initial hype was all based on this kind of hackerish kind of ethos, this figure of Satoshi Nakamoto who was mysterious. People wanted to get involved. It was exciting and interesting. In the case of Dogecoin, they managed to do it via creating a very emotional kind of image, and people that really responded to it. The Dogecoin community has skyrocketed in literally the last couple of months against the expectations of everybody who said, oh, this is a joke currency. And the amazing thing about what they've proven was actually people don't respond to things based on how well something is designed. People respond to things about how it makes them feel and how they're if they're part of a community. That said, I don't know what the future of Dogecoin is. I've used it. I've actually sold a few books for it. I use it to tip people and stuff, but it remains to be seen.
Actually, we're getting the same question twice. Isn't Bitcoin a much bigger innovation than Bitcoin as a currency? By meaning Bitcoin as a protocol, and I think even my presentation at the beginning, it was more showing that actually the key thing of Bitcoin is the protocol. We're having a decentralized ledger instead of having a currency. Another question is actually asked by the same person, and the one question is, what's left after Mighty Gox collapse? And I would like to answer it. So actually, the Mighty Gox was one of the biggest exchanges of Bitcoin, and it was one of the earliest exchanges of Bitcoin, and it collapsed in February because their funds disappeared. And there are many probable reasons why it collapsed. Maybe it was fraud, maybe the Bitcoins were stolen, and so on. But actually, what it shows, for example, because Bitcoin is a decentralized currency, so actually every aspect of it should be decentralized. As well as exchanges, because if it's, let's say, only one exchange like Mt. Gox, who has, let's say, 80% of market, then it actually becomes too big to fail. So actually there should be a lesson that there should be more and more exchanges. Let's say there should be 20 exchanges around the globe, each having, let's say, 5% of the market. So if one fails, there is no failure of the market. And another question I would like to ask in a similar way, and the question says, how industrial farm stations will affect the overall Bitcoin market? And I think that's mean about mining. The mining is confirmation of the transactions for the public ledger, for the decentralized ledger, and actually it actually works like a democracy, because you actually have to have half of the miners, at least half of the 5 miners, to accept the payment, for payment to be accepted for the long term. So it's actually the same way about the decentralized at every stage. So you should not have more huge firm which controls, let's say, half of a market. because that actually makes all the protocol decentralized because it's actually controlled by one company. While there are no motivation for the spams to take the monopoly in the market, because then they will know that the Bitcoin will lose reputation, so that's why they are motivated to have like a small fraction of this mining industry. Maybe somebody else we have to ask on this aspect about the empty gogs and like industrial farms of mining. Because another question is about the taxation proceedings for Bitcoin in Lithuania. So the question was asked by Tadas, and the answer is actually the tax inspection of Lithuania has actually published the instruction how the Bitcoin has to be taxed, how it's stated in the tax, and actually you can read on it. And I think that's because in Lithuania it's more looked as a currency, while like what you see what happened in States, they actually look at it more as an asset class. So in States actually they made this barrier by law, by IRS, because as Bitcoin is an asset, so every transaction in Bitcoin has to be filled in your tax report. So it it loses actually this easy of use when you actually use it as a cash, and because now you actually have to track every personal transaction. And I think that's a bad approach from a country because it stops the progress in the competition way, because probably Bitcoin will not be the dominating currency, but I think it's a good challenge for all existing payment systems to get better and better.
Should I say something there?
Yes.
Just on this issue of taxation, it's quite an interesting philosophical issue to some extent because it really depends on what you perceive Bitcoin to be. And this is what a lot of the national regulators are struggling with, is this a currency or is it quote unquote an asset, whatever that means, or is it a commodity? Theoretically, a currency is something you use to make exchanges, right? Like it's supposed to facilitate goods moving around. Then you have an asset, which is supposed to be an investment vehicle, basically. And an asset is basically supposed to be something which gives you something back over time. And much like if you bought a farm and you could use it to make things, and you would get returns back in the form of dividends or interest or whatever you want to call that. That's an asset. You know, it's supposed to be productive in some sense. And a commodity is supposed to be something you can actually use. And in a way, Bitcoin is sort of none of those in some ways. It's certainly not an asset in the sense it doesn't produce anything. It has no productive value in and of itself. It's much more like a currency in the sense that it could theoretically be used to make exchanges, but people are imagining it as an asset, which is why it's having all these fluctuations. And it's certainly not a commodity because you can't actually consume it. And I want to make one pushback on this notion. Well, not a pushback, but just a comment on monetary theory. There's this pervasive idea that money is a means of exchange and a store of value. And these are the core features of what money is supposed to do. If you think about this concept, and there's a lot of ideas about it, it's supposed to be scarce at the same time. If you think about a very useful store of value, let's imagine oil, for example, and imagine it was scarce. Would it be a good means of exchange? No, people would consume it. Basically, if you have a commodity that's useful and that it's scarce, it's a terrible currency because people consume it instead of using it as a currency. And the ideal form of currency you want to create in society is one that has the sort of pseudo appearance of kind of being valuable whilst not really being valuable. Because if it actually is valuable in itself, you don't use it as a currency. So this is the key sort of psychological trick to creating a currency. And I'll maybe leave that at my last point.
And the last question, because we're running out of time, it actually was asked to Remigijus. What is actually the real value of fiat currency? Is it not very similar to Bitcoin because it's still just a paper?
Of course, it's similar, but I'm not sure whether everyone knows what is fiat currency. Fiat currency is let it be currency. Fiat is let it be. So if somebody declares something being a currency, let it be litas or whatever else, so this is let it be currency with no real base, it's not covered by something. Litas is actually covered by something. It's covered by other fiat currencies, euros first. And it's like 13 billion litas covered by other fiat currencies. So it is not classical fiat currency. It has some values expressed in some other fiat currencies.
So the panel is over. I would like to thank my colleagues Remigijus and Brad for coming and finding a time to come to this panel. And thanks a lot for attending this panel discussion.